A police officer stops a black woman in a Lamborghini, then learns she's the head of internal affairs. A quiet evening in a small town, where the roar of a sleek Lamborghini shatters the calm. Behind the wheel is a poised black woman, exuding confidence. But not far behind, a patrol car's lights flash. A cop on a power trip, ready to make assumptions that will change his life forever. Little does he know, the woman he's stopping isn't just anyone. She holds the very authority that could unravel everything he stands for. What happens when prejudice meets power? Stay with me, because this story will leave you speechless. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The sun was setting over the quiet streets of Willow Creek, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson. It was the kind of town where change felt like an outsider, and tradition clung to every corner. The roads were mostly lined with modest sedans and rusted trucks, reflecting the town's working-class roots. Tonight, however, the roar of a Lamborghini Aventador shattered the calm like a thunderclap, its sleek black frame cutting through the dusk like a predator in motion. Behind the wheel sat Rebecca Stone, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel with practiced ease. Her dark skin glowed faintly in the warm light streaming through the windshield, and her sharp eyes scanned the road ahead. She wasn't in a rush. Rebecca never rushed. She knew the power of presence, how to command attention without speaking, and the car was no different. It purred as if it were alive, waiting for her next command. She eased to a stop at a red light, her reflection briefly catching her eye in the rearview mirror. She adjusted her blazer, its tailored cut exuding professionalism and authority. This wasn't a joy ride, it was a statement. From across the street, Officer Tyler's gaze locked onto her. He sat in his patrol car parked near the corner diner, sipping on lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw the Lamborghini. The car didn't belong here, and judging by the driver, neither did she. Suspicious, he muttered to himself, setting his cup down. His fingers itched to reach for the siren. Tyler thrived on these moments, the little power plays that made his badge feel heavier on his chest. He didn't recognize the driver, but he didn't need to. In his mind, she was out of place, an anomaly that begged for his intervention. Rebecca noticed the patrol car the moment she stopped. Years of training had sharpened her instincts, and the sight of a cop lingering too long on her vehicle wasn't new. She kept her expression neutral, though her mind worked quickly. He's going to pull me over. The light turned green, and Rebecca moved forward, keeping her speed well within the limit. She knew the rules and played by them with precision. Yet, as she checked her mirrors, the patrol car eased into traffic behind her, its headlights a silent declaration. Tyler followed at a distance, his suspicion mounting with every turn. His radio crackled to life, but he ignored it, focusing solely on the Lamborghini. "Let's see where this goes," he muttered, reaching for the dashboard camera. The streets grew quieter as Rebecca left the busier parts of town. She was headed to a meeting with the local precinct, a routine stop in her role as the head of internal affairs. But tonight, routine was an illusion. The blaring sound of a siren pierced the air, cutting through the silence like a whip. Rebecca glanced at the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. "Here we go." She guided the Lamborghini to the side of the road, her movements deliberate and composed. As the engine quieted, Rebecca inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She knew how this would play out. The script had been written long before she'd even reached this town. Tyler parked his patrol car behind her and stepped out, adjusting his belt with the practiced arrogance of someone who believed the uniform made him untouchable. He approached the driver's side window with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes scanning the car as though it were evidence of a crime. Rebecca lowered the window, the hum of the motor a quiet counterpoint to the tension building between them. "Evening, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Evening," Tyler replied, leaning slightly to peer inside the car. His tone was laced with suspicion. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Rebecca tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze with an unflinching stare. "No, I don't. Perhaps you could enlighten me." Tyler's lips tightened. He didn't like her tone. Too confident, too self-assured. "You were driving erratically," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "And this car doesn't exactly blend in around here." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Driving erratically?" I'm sure your dash cam will confirm otherwise. Tyler straightened, his face hardening. He hadn't expected pushback. Most people he stopped were too flustered to question him. License and registration. He snapped, his hand hovering near his belt as if to remind her of his authority. Rebecca reached into her glove compartment slowly, her movements measured. She handed over her documents without a word, her expression unreadable. Tyler took them, his eyes flicking between her license and the registration. Nice car, he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. You don't see many of these around here. Rebecca didn't respond. She let the silence stretch, forcing him to fill the void. Tyler frowned, shifting on his feet. Is this your car? He asked, the question laced with accusation. It is, Rebecca replied, her voice cool and steady. Is there a problem? Tyler's jaw clenched. Sit tight, he said, turning on his heel and heading back to his patrol car. He didn't need to run her license to know it would come back clean, but something about her, the car, her demeanor made him itch for control. Inside the Lamborghini, Rebecca leaned back in her seat, her hands resting on her lap. Her calm exterior belied the fire simmering beneath. She dealt with men like Tyler before, men who saw her success as a threat, her skin as a justification for their bias. Let him play his game, she thought. He has no idea who he's dealing with. Tyler sat in his patrol car, tapping Rebecca's license against the steering wheel. His eyes darted to the computer screen as her name and information appeared. Rebecca Stone. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. What stood out, however, was the clean record. No warrants, no prior offenses, nothing he could use to justify his escalating suspicion. He leaned back in his seat, chewing the inside of his cheek. The pristine background wasn't enough to deter him. Something about her confidence had rubbed him the wrong way. She hadn't flinched, hadn't faltered under his scrutiny. Most people would have been apologizing by now, fumbling over their words, trying to placate him. But not her. She thinks she's untouchable, he thought bitterly. Let's see about that. He clicked on her vehicle registration, scrolling through the details. The Lamborghini was registered under her name. Everything checked out, but Tyler wasn't satisfied. He picked up his radio, his voice low as he called for backup. Unit 45, requesting assistance at location Elm and 5th. Possible stolen vehicle. Driver is uncooperative. The words rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, bending the truth just enough to suit his narrative. He hung up the radio and glanced in the rearview mirror. The Lamborghini sat idly, its polished frame reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. Inside, Rebecca watched the patrol car with unwavering focus. She could see Tyler moving around, his silhouette tense and deliberate. She'd been in enough situations like this to recognize the signs. He was stalling, looking for a reason to escalate. Her calm demeanor was a thorn in his side, and she wasn't about to hand him anything to work with. Her phone buzzed in the console, a discreet vibration that drew her attention. She glanced at the screen, a text from her assistant reminding her of tomorrow's agenda. Rebecca tapped out a quick response, keeping her movements deliberate and visible in case Tyler was watching. Outside, the sound of tires crunching against asphalt broke the stillness. A second patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing. Tyler stepped out, his body language shifting slightly as he adjusted his belt. He approached the other officer, a younger man with a hesitant expression, and began speaking in hushed tones. Rebecca caught snippets of their conversation through the open window. Words like suspicious, stolen, and uncooperative floated through the air, each one more ridiculous than the last. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to paint her as a criminal for existing in a space they didn't think she belonged. The younger officer, Officer Hayes, approached the Lamborghini cautiously, his steps slower than Tyler's had been. He glanced back at his partner, uncertainty flickering across his face, before turning to Rebecca. "Ma'am," he began, his voice tentative, "do you mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment?" Rebecca tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but firm. "Is there a reason for that, Officer Hayes?" Hayes hesitated, glancing at Tyler, who gestured sharply for him to proceed. "We just need to verify some information." Rebecca nodded slowly. "And will you be providing me with a clear explanation for this request, or should I assume this is a baseless escalation?" Hayes's face reddened slightly, and he took a step back, unsure how to respond. Tyler stepped forward, his posture aggressive. "This isn't optional," Tyler snapped, his hand hovering near his holster. "Step out of the car now." Rebecca exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against the door handle. She didn't want this to escalate further, but she also wouldn't allow them to treat her dignity as collateral. With measured grace, she opened the door and stepped out, standing tall despite the situation. Her presence was commanding, even in the face of their hostility. She straightened her blazer, smoothing the fabric as if this were a routine business interaction. "I hope you're aware of the legal implications of your actions, officers," she said, her voice steady and firm. "This vehicle is legally registered in my name. I've provided you with all the necessary documentation. If you're continuing this detainment, I will need to understand your justification." Tyler's jaw tightened. "We're just doing our job. And your job includes fabricating suspicions about law-abiding citizens?" Rebecca asked, her tone sharp but measured. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Rebecca and Tyler. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that made people instinctively step back. But Rebecca didn't move. She held her ground, her gaze never wavering. Tyler stepped closer, his expression darkening. "You're walking a fine line, lady." Rebecca arched an eyebrow. "And you've already crossed one." Before Tyler could respond, a third car approached, a sleek black sedan that came to a smooth stop at the curb. The door opened, and a tall man in a sharp suit stepped out. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic, drawing the attention of everyone on the scene. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. His eyes flicked to Rebecca, a glimmer of recognition passing between them. Rebecca allowed herself a faint smile. "Not anymore." Tyler's confusion deepened as the man approached, his polished demeanor clashing starkly with the escalating chaos of the scene. Something in his gut told him this wasn't going to end the way he'd planned. The tension in the air felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Tyler's eyes darted from the sleek black sedan to the man in the suit who had emerged. Everything about the newcomer radiated authority, his polished appearance, his unhurried stride, the way his sharp gaze assessed the scene with precision. Rebecca's faint smile deepened as the man approached. She folded her arms, her stance calm, yet commanding. "Mr. Phillips," she greeted, her voice warm but tinged with formality. "I wasn't expecting you this evening." Phillips nodded, his eyes briefly meeting hers before shifting to the two officers. "I happened to be in the area," he said, his tone measured. "And it looks like I arrived just in time." Tyler straightened, trying to reassert his authority. "Sir, this is a routine traffic stop. We're conducting an investigation." Phillips's sharp eyes locked onto Tyler's, and for a moment, the officer faltered under the weight of his gaze. "An investigation?" Phillips repeated, his tone cutting through the night like a blade. "Into what, precisely?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like harassment." Tyler's face darkened. This individual was driving a high-end vehicle in a manner that raised suspicion. "We have procedures to follow." Phillips tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a faint, sardonic smile. "Procedures, is it?" He took a slow step closer, his hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me, Officer Tyler, what part of your procedure involves accusing a law-abiding citizen of a crime without a shred of evidence?" Rebecca stayed silent, her gaze flicking between Tyler and Phillips. She recognized this moment for what it was, a shift in the balance of power. Phillips's arrival was a calculated move, a reminder that the system Tyler thought he controlled had layers far beyond his understanding. Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but Phillips raised a hand, cutting him off. "Don't bother," he said sharply. "I've already seen enough." His gaze shifted to Officer Hayes, who stood stiffly to the side, visibly uncomfortable. "And you?" Phillips asked. "Are you complicit in this circus, or are you just following orders?" Hayes swallowed hard, his cheeks coloring. "I was just assisting," he stammered. "I didn't mean any harm." Phillips sighed, his expression softening slightly. "That much is clear. I suggest you reconsider the company you keep, Officer Hayes. It might save your career." Hayes's shoulders slumped, and he glanced at Tyler, who glared back, his jaw tight. The silence between them spoke volumes. Phillips turned to Rebecca, his demeanor shifting instantly. "Miss Stone, I apologize for this inconvenience. Rest assured, this matter will be addressed promptly." Rebecca inclined her head, her smile returning. "Thank you, Mr. Phillips. I trust it will be." Tyler frowned, his frustration boiling over. "What exactly is going on here?" he demanded. "Who is this woman?" Phillips turned back to him, his expression now ice cold. "This woman, as you so dismissively put it, is Rebecca Stone, head of internal affairs for the State Police Division." He let the words sink in, watching as Tyler's face turned pale. "And I," Phillips continued, his voice like steel. Am her legal counsel. So unless you'd like to explain your actions in front of a state tribunal, I suggest you start cooperating. Tyler took an involuntary step back, his confidence unraveling. I didn't know, he stammered. Phillips's smile returned, sharp and unforgiving. Ignorance is no excuse, officer. You acted with bias, hostility, and complete disregard for the law. That's not just misconduct, it's criminal. Rebecca stepped forward, her presence filling the space. Officer Tyler, she said, her voice calm but cutting. I'll need your badge number, your supervisor's name, and a copy of this STOPS incident report. I trust you've been recording this interaction. Tyler hesitated, the weight of the question bearing down on him. Yes, he muttered. Good, Rebecca replied. I'll be requesting that footage as part of my investigation. Hayes glanced at Tyler, then at Rebecca, his internal struggle clear. Finally, he stepped forward, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. Ma'am, he said hesitantly, I'll provide you with the information you need. Rebecca's gaze softened slightly. Thank you, Officer Hayes. I appreciate your professionalism. Phillips checked his watch, then looked at Tyler. You have two choices, officer, he said. You can cooperate now, or you can explain your actions to a disciplinary board later. Choose wisely. Tyler's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He fumbled for his badge number, muttering it under his breath as he handed it over. Rebecca took the information, tucking it neatly into her pocket. Thank you, she said, her tone cool but final. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more important matters to attend to. She turned, her heels clicking softly against the pavement as she walked back to her Lamborghini. The car gleamed under the streetlights, a stark contrast to the grim expressions of the officers left behind. As she slid into the driver's seat, Rebecca glanced in the rearview mirror. Tyler stood rigid, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. Hayes looked down, avoiding eye contact with anyone, and Phillips, ever composed, leaned casually against his sedan, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. Rebecca started the engine, the roar slicing through the tension like a blade. She didn't need to look back. She knew the tide had turned, and this was only the beginning. Tyler doesn't realize it yet, she thought as she pulled away, but his badge is already as good as gone. The streets of Willow Creek grew quieter as Rebecca's Lamborghini merged onto the main highway. The roar of the engine was steady, but her mind was anything but. Despite her calm exterior during the encounter, a familiar undercurrent of frustration coursed through her. She had hoped that in her position, encounters like this would become relics of the past, but here she was again, proof that authority didn't always shield her from prejudice. The lights of her dashboard illuminated the car's interior, casting a faint glow across her face. She adjusted her hands on the steering wheel, her knuckles tight against the smooth leather. The sound of her phone buzzing against the console drew her attention. With a quick tap on her Bluetooth, the call connected. Rebecca Stone, she answered, her voice steady but clipped. Rebecca, it's Jenkins, came the voice of her assistant, calm but carrying a hint of urgency. I heard about the incident. Are you all right? Rebecca exhaled slowly, easing her grip on the wheel. I'm fine, Jenkins. The situation is under control. I thought so, Jenkins replied, a note of relief in his voice. But words already spreading. Officer Tyler isn't exactly known for subtlety. Rebecca smirked faintly, the corners of her mouth curling. I gathered as much. What have you found on him? There was a pause, followed by the sound of keys clacking. Jenkins had a talent for digging up information faster than most people could blink. Tyler has a record. Internal complaints, mostly swept under the rug. Excessive force, racial profiling, abuse of authority. Nothing ever stuck, though. It seems he's protected by someone higher up in the department. Rebecca's expression darkened, her jaw tightening. She'd suspected as much. Officers like Tyler didn't operate unchecked without some form of institutional support. Who's backing him? Chief Donnelly, Jenkins replied. He's been in his position for nearly 2 decades. Rumors suggest he's got connections that keep him untouchable. Tyler is one of his favorites. Always defended him when complaints came in. Rebecca's fingers tapped lightly against the wheel as she processed the information. This wasn't just about Tyler. It was about the system that enabled him, a system she had dedicated her career to dismantling. Jenkins, she said, her voice sharper now. I want every piece of evidence you can find on Tyler and Donnelly. Complaints, reports, anything that's been buried. And make sure it's airtight. No loopholes. You've got it, Jenkins replied without hesitation. Do you want this handled quietly, or should I prepare for a full investigation? Rebecca thought for a moment, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. Prepare for both, she said. We'll start quietly, but if they push back, I want enough leverage to take it public. Understood, Jenkins said. I'll have a full report ready by morning. The call ended, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts. The hum of the engine filled the silence as she replayed the night's events in her mind. Tyler's arrogance, Hayes's hesitation, Phillips's impeccable timing. It all fit into a larger puzzle, one she was determined to piece together. Tyler stormed into the precinct, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed harsher than usual, casting a sterile glow over the worn desks and scattered papers. His colleagues looked up as he entered, their curiosity piqued by his uncharacteristic silence. Rough night, one of them asked, smirking as he leaned back in his chair. Shut it, Tyler snapped, slamming his badge and gun onto his desk. The metallic clatter echoed through the room, drawing more attention. Officer Hayes trailed in behind him, his expression tense. Unlike Tyler, he hadn't been able to shake the unease that lingered after the encounter. He approached Tyler cautiously, lowering his voice. You know this isn't going to end well, right? Tyler shot him a glare. What are you talking about? You heard what Phillips said. Hayes replied, his voice edged with frustration. That woman isn't just anyone. She's internal affairs. She's not going to let this slide. Tyler scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Let her try? Donnelly will handle it, just like he always does. Hayes hesitated, his unease growing. You're putting a lot of faith in Donnelly. What if this time is different? What if she's the one who finally brings him down? Tyler's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with bravado. She won't. Donnelly's untouchable. You'll see. Rebecca arrived at the state police headquarters just as the sun broke over the horizon. The building's sleek, modern design stood in stark contrast to the small-town precinct she'd encountered the night before. Inside, Jenkins was already waiting, a folder thick with documents in his hands. Good morning, he greeted, handing her the file. It's all here. Tyler's misconduct record, Donnelly's connections, and a few skeletons I found in their closets. Rebecca opened the folder, scanning the contents with practiced efficiency. The evidence was damning. Dozens of complaints, falsified reports, even a pattern of discriminatory traffic stops that correlated with Tyler's patrol routes. It was more than enough to initiate an investigation. Jenkins watched her carefully. What's the plan? Rebecca closed the folder, her expression steely. We start with Tyler. He's the weaker link. If we pressure him enough, he'll crack and lead us straight to Donnelly. And if he doesn't? Jenkins asked. Rebecca's gaze sharpened. Then we take Donnelly down the hard way. Jenkins nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. I'll start setting up the interview. You'll have your first meeting with Tyler by noon. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, the weight of the task ahead settling over her. She wasn't just fighting Tyler or Donnelly. She was fighting the system they represented. But she'd come too far to back down now. As the clock ticked toward noon, Rebecca prepared herself for the battle ahead. Tyler didn't know it yet, but the noose was already tightening, and she was the one holding the rope. The interrogation room was a stark, windowless space lit by a single fluorescent light. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Rebecca sat at the head of the steel table, her posture impeccably straight, her hands folded loosely in front of her. Across from her sat Officer Tyler, his usual arrogance diminished but not entirely extinguished. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, a forced smirk playing on his lips. Between them was a thick file folder, its contents carefully curated to dismantle any facade of innocence Tyler might cling to. Rebecca's gaze never left his, unflinching and unervingly calm. Officer Tyler, she began, her voice low and deliberate. I trust you understand why you've been called here. Tyler shrugged, his smirk widening. Routine debriefing, I assume? I didn't realize a simple traffic stop warranted all this. Rebecca didn't react to his tone. She opened the folder, flipping through a few pages before sliding a document across the table. This, she said, tapping the page, is a summary of complaints filed against you over the past 5 years. Excessive force, racial profiling, misconduct. Care to explain? Tyler glanced at the document, but didn't pick it up. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Complaints don't mean guilt, he said smoothly. You of all people should know that. Rebecca tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Complaints don't mean guilt, no? But patterns. Patterns tell a story. And your pattern, Officer Tyler, is one of abuse and bias. Tyler's jaw tightened, his smirk faltering. If there's a problem with how I do my job, my superiors would have addressed it. They haven't, Rebecca said sharply, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. And that's exactly why I'm here. The silence that followed was deafening. Tyler shifted in his chair, the weight of Rebecca's words pressing down on him. He glanced at the one-way mirror behind her, as if seeking reassurance, but none came. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her tone softening but losing none of its authority. Tyler, let me be clear. This isn't just about last night's stop. That was the tipping point, but the problem runs deeper. You operated under the assumption that your actions would go unchecked. That ends now. Tyler chuckled dryly, though the sound lacked conviction. What? You're going to take my badge? Ruin my career? You don't scare me. Rebecca's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, her calm facade cracked just enough to reveal the steel beneath. This isn't about fear, Officer Tyler. It's about accountability. And your badge, your career, is the least of your worries. She pulled another document from the folder and slid it across the table. This one was a detailed report, a compilation of Tyler's traffic stops over the past year. Do you see this? She asked, her tone icy. These are the names of every individual you've stopped. Notice anything unusual? Tyler glanced at the report, his brow furrowing. What's your point? Rebecca tapped the page again. 80% of your stops involve minorities, despite the demographics of your patrol area. And these aren't minor infractions. Many of these stops led to unwarranted searches, excessive use of force, and in several cases, fabricated charges. Tyler's face reddened, his composure slipping. Those were legitimate stops. I was doing my job. Your job, Rebecca said, her voice rising ever so slightly, does not include targeting individuals based on their race or manufacturing reasons to escalate situations. Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but Rebecca cut him off. And let's not forget your mentor, Chief Donnelly. He's been remarkably silent on these complaints, almost as if he's shielding you. The mention of Donnelly visibly shook Tyler. His smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a flicker of panic. Donnelly, Tyler stammered, his words trailing off. Rebecca leaned back, watching him carefully. You don't have to protect him, she said, her tone soft but firm. You think he'll protect you, but trust me, when the walls close in, you'll be the first one he sacrifices. Tyler clenched his fists, his eyes darting between Rebecca and the folder. The silence stretched, the weight of the evidence and her words pressing down on him. Let me make this simple, Rebecca continued. You have a choice. Cooperate with this investigation, tell me everything about Donnelly's involvement, and we may consider leniency. Or you can refuse and face the full consequences on your own. Tyler's breathing grew heavier, the walls of the interrogation room seeming to shrink around him. He glanced at the folder, then back at Rebecca, his confidence crumbling. Rebecca didn't rush him. She knew the signs, the delicate balance of pressure and patience required to break someone like Tyler. The silence was her ally, a tool to let him stew in his own doubt. Finally, he exhaled sharply, slumping in his chair. What do you want to know? He muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca's expression remained neutral, but a glint of satisfaction flickered in her eyes. Everything, she said, leaning forward once more. Start with last night. Then we'll move on to Donnelly. Chief Donnelly sat behind his large oak desk, the blinds half drawn to block out the morning sun. His office was a shrine to his decades of service, plaques, photos, and awards lining the walls. But the weight of those accolades felt hollow today. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Come in, he barked. Officer Hayes stepped inside, his demeanor hesitant. Chief, we have a problem. Donnelly's eyes narrowed. What kind of problem? It's Tyler, Hayes said, his voice shaky. He's talking. Donnelly froze, the air in the room growing heavy. Talking? About what? Everything, Hayes replied. Rebecca Stone's got him in the interrogation room, and he's spilling it all. Donnelly's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. That little weasel, he muttered under his breath. I knew he'd fold the moment someone put pressure on him. What do we do? Hayes asked, his voice betraying his unease. Donnelly's eyes hardened, his expression cold and calculating. We contain it. Stone thinks she's got the upper hand, but she doesn't know who she's dealing with. Hayes hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Understood. As Hayes left the office, Donnelly stared at the door, his mind churning with plans. He wasn't going down without a fight. Not now, not ever. But deep down, a small, insistent voice whispered a truth he refused to acknowledge. The walls were closing in, and this time, there might be no escape. Rebecca returned to her office at the State Police Division, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily on her shoulders. She had achieved what she had set out to do. Tyler had cracked, his bravado melting away under the weight of evidence and her unyielding presence. But the battle was far from over. Tyler's confessions were only the first step in dismantling the web of corruption that surrounded Chief Donnelly. She set the thick case file on her desk, its contents spilling out slightly, as if to remind her of the mountain of work still ahead. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Rebecca sat down, her hands resting on the polished wood of the desk as she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. Her thoughts drifted to the interrogation. Tyler's fear had been palpable, his words stumbling over one another as he recounted the extent of Donnelly's influence. Tyler's voice had been a low, hurried whisper, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Donnelly, he's been covering for me, for all of us. He has connections, powerful connections, people in the mayor's office, even the state legislature. He makes problems disappear. Rebecca had leaned forward, her gaze sharp and unrelenting. And in return, what does he expect from you? Tyler had swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. Loyalty. Blind loyalty. He gives orders, we follow them. No questions. If we don't, he finds ways to ruin us. And these orders? Rebecca had pressed, her voice steady but edged with steel. What kind of orders are we talking about? Tyler's hands had trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. Targeting people. Specific people. Minorities mostly. He calls it cleaning up the streets, but it's not about crime. It's about control. Keeping certain people in line, keeping the mayor happy, and showing the town that he's in charge. Rebecca had let the silence stretch, letting Tyler's words hang in the air. Finally, she'd spoken, her voice colder than he'd ever heard it. And you followed those orders? Tyler had looked down, unable to meet her eyes. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice, Officer Tyler, Rebecca had replied, her voice soft but unwavering. You just made the wrong one. The memory stirred a bitter taste in her mouth. Tyler's cooperation was a step forward, but his confession also highlighted the rot that had spread through the department under Donnelly's reign. It wasn't just about one man. It was about a culture of unchecked power and systemic bias that had festered for years. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a message from Jenkins. Meeting with the AG scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow. All files ready for review. Rebecca exhaled slowly. The Attorney General's office would be a critical ally in this fight. With their backing, she could escalate the investigation, taking it beyond the confines of the department and into the public eye if necessary. A soft knock at her door drew her attention. Come in, she called. The door opened, and Jenkins stepped inside, a laptop tucked under his arm. He looked as composed as ever, though a hint of concern flickered in his eyes. I thought you might want an update before you call it a night. Rebecca gestured for him to sit. Let's hear it. Jenkins opened his laptop, pulling up a series of files. Tyler's testimony checks out. We've cross-referenced his claims with internal records, and the patterns are undeniable. Donnelly has been selectively burying complaints, falsifying reports, and reallocating resources to protect his inner circle. Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. And the connections he mentioned? The mayor's office? The state legislature? Jenkins nodded, his fingers tapping the keyboard. There's a paper trail. Emails, phone records, even some questionable campaign contributions. It's not concrete enough to take to court yet, but it's a start. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. And the officers under Donnelly's command? How deep does their loyalty run? Jenkins hesitated, then sighed. It's mixed. Some, like Tyler, are just pawns, scared and complicit because they feel they have no choice. Others, they're true believers. They buy into Donnelly's rhetoric and would go down with him if it came to that. Rebecca nodded slowly, her gaze distant. Divide and conquer, then. We'll start with the weak links and build from there. Jenkins closed his laptop, studying her carefully. You know this isn't going to be easy, Rebecca. Donnelly's been in power for a long time. He won't go down without a fight. Rebecca's eyes met his, their intensity unwavering. I'm counting on it. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds in Rebecca's office, casting long, slanted shadows across her desk. The weight of the upcoming meeting with the Attorney General sat heavy in her chest, But Rebecca was no stranger to pressure. Today was pivotal. Today, the investigation would take its first decisive step toward dismantling the corruption that had poisoned the department. She sipped her coffee, its warmth steadying her nerves as she reviewed the files Jenkins had meticulously prepared. Tyler's testimony, coupled with the patterns of misconduct and buried complaints, painted a damning picture of Chief Donnelly's reign. But Rebecca knew the path ahead wasn't just about evidence. It was about maneuvering through a system designed to resist accountability. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from Jenkins, arrived early. Meeting room is set up. AG's team is reviewing the files now. Rebecca replied with a quick "on my way" and stood, collecting her materials. As she moved toward the door, her eyes flicked to the security monitor in the corner of the room, a precaution she had insisted on when she first took the position. It displayed a live feed of the hallway outside her office. Today, it showed nothing unusual, just the faint hum of office activity. Still, Rebecca's instincts itched. She had learned long ago to trust them. The streets of the city bustled with the rhythms of early commuters, but Rebecca's mind was elsewhere as she drove. She replayed the events of the past few days. Tyler's crack under pressure, Jenkins's discovery of the paper trail, and Donnelly's calculated silence. All of it pointed to a man who was planning his counterstrike. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. At a stoplight, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it cautiously. It was an unknown number, a text message with no context or signature. "Stop this. Won't end well for you." Rebecca's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her pulse quickening. She stared at the message, the bluntness of it gnawing at her resolve. She was no stranger to threats, but the timing was deliberate, calculated to unsettle her before the meeting. She slipped the phone into the cup holder, her jaw tightening. Let them try. The conference room was a blend of modern austerity and old-world gravitas. Tall windows flooded the space with light, and the polished wood of the long table gleamed under the chandeliers. Rebecca entered to find Jenkins already seated, his laptop open as he spoke with two members of the AG's team. "Rebecca," he greeted, standing as she approached. "They've been going through the files. The evidence is holding up well." One of the team members, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of authority, nodded. "The patterns are compelling. If we can corroborate everything, this could lead to a statewide investigation." Rebecca took her seat, her resolve hardening. "Good. That's exactly what we need. Donnelly's influence stretches beyond Willow Creek, and the longer we wait, the more damage he'll do." Jenkins handed her a copy of the agenda, his voice low. "You'll need to walk them through Tyler's testimony. They want to see if he's credible enough to use as a primary witness." Rebecca nodded, flipping through the pages. "He's credible enough for now, but we need to act fast. The moment Donnelly senses we're coming for him, he'll start covering his tracks." As she spoke, her phone vibrated softly against the table. She glanced at the screen and froze. Another message from the unknown number. "Last warning. Walk away." Jenkins noticed her hesitation, his brows knitting. "Everything okay?" Rebecca turned the phone toward him, the message still displayed. His expression darkened. "This isn't random. Someone knows you're closing in." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. "Donnelly," she said quietly. "He's trying to rattle me." Jenkins's voice was firm. "We should report this. Whoever sent that message could escalate." Rebecca shook her head. "Not yet. If we react too soon, we risk tipping our hand. Let's focus on the meeting. The investigation comes first." Donnelly sat in his office, his fingers drumming against the desk. The faint sound of typing filled the room as his secretary worked just outside the door. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from a burner number, delivered the warning. No response yet. Donnelly smirked, leaning back in his chair. Stone was tough, but everyone had a breaking point. He'd seen it before, strong-willed adversaries who folded under the right amount of pressure. The key was knowing when to push and when to strike. He deleted the message, his smirk fading as he turned his attention to the stack of papers on his desk. Rebecca's investigation was gaining momentum, and he couldn't afford any mistakes. If she kept digging, it wouldn't just be Tyler who fell, it would be him. But Donnelly wasn't a man who went down without a fight. Rebecca stood at the head of the table, presenting Tyler's testimony with meticulous detail. The AG's team listened intently, their questions probing but fair. Each answer she provided felt like another piece of armor being forged, another layer of protection against the onslaught she knew was coming. As she concluded her presentation, the sharp-eyed woman spoke again. "Your case is strong, Miss Stone, But Donnelly isn't just any police chief. He has connections, resources. If we move forward with this, we'll need to be prepared for backlash. Rebecca nodded, her gaze steady. I understand. But this isn't just about Donnelly. It's about the system that's allowed him to thrive. We dismantle him, and we send a message that no one is above accountability. The woman exchanged a glance with her colleagues, then turned back to Rebecca. We'll take it to the Attorney General. If they approve, you'll have the full backing of the state. Relief mixed with determination as Rebecca sat down. The first hurdle had been cleared, but the road ahead was treacherous. Rebecca stood by the window of her office, her arms crossed tightly across her chest as she stared out at the city skyline. The day's success at the Attorney General's office should have felt like a victory, but the unease from the anonymous threats lingered, gnawing at the edges of her focus. The words on the messages weren't idle. She could feel the weight of their intent. Behind her, Jenkins worked silently, his fingers tapping against his laptop as he combed through phone records and digital traces, searching for the origin of the threats. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, his jaw tight with concentration. I've got something, Jenkins said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was low, wary. Rebecca turned, her brow furrowed. What is it? Jenkins pushed his chair back slightly and turned the laptop toward her. The messages were sent from a burner phone, but it pinged a cell tower near Willow Creek Precinct. Whoever sent this is local. Rebecca nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications. It's Donnelly or someone close to him. He's too calculated to outsource something like this. Jenkins hesitated. There's more. The burner phone hasn't been used for any other calls or messages. It's clean, which means it's been prepped for this purpose. That takes planning. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a deliberate effort to unsettle her, a warning that the stakes were higher than she had anticipated. Rebecca awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The sunlight streaming through her window was a stark contrast to the shadows of the previous night. Today, she would confront Donnelly's power directly, but she knew the battle would not be fought in the open. It would unfold in whispers, maneuvering, and decisive strikes. Her morning began with a quiet meeting in her office. Jenkins, as always, was punctual, his laptop open and a fresh pot of coffee brewing on the side table. We've got it, Jenkins said, skipping pleasantries. The meeting at Willow Creek. It's happening in the precinct's conference room at 10 a.m. Donnelly's key players will be there, his most loyal officers, including some higher-ups from the mayor's office. Rebecca leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. Do we have eyes inside? Jenkins smirked. I thought you'd ask. I managed to plant a mic in the room during a routine inspection last month. It's discreet. No one's found it yet. We'll have live audio. Rebecca nodded, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her face. Good. I want to know every word. What's the contingency plan if they suspect anything? I've scrambled the signal source, Jenkins assured her. If they find the mic, it'll trace back to an untraceable burner. We're safe. Chief Donnelly stood at the head of the long conference table, his hands gripping the edge as he addressed the room. Around him sat a dozen officers, their expressions ranging from nervous to defiant. The tension was palpable. We're under attack, Donnelly began, his voice low but commanding. Rebecca Stone thinks she can waltz in here and tear this department apart. She doesn't understand what she's up against. One officer, a younger man with a hesitant demeanor, raised his hand. But Chief, what if she has enough evidence? Tyler's already talking, and we all know what that means. Donnelly's glare silenced him. Tyler's a coward, and cowards are replaceable. What matters is that we close ranks. If anyone here has second thoughts, now's the time to walk away. No one moved, but the room grew heavier with unspoken doubt. The audio feed played softly on Jenkins's laptop as he and Rebecca listened. Donnelly's voice carried through the speakers, dripping with controlled fury. He's doubling down, Jenkins observed. He's scared, but he's not backing off. Rebecca tapped her pen against the desk, her mind racing. Scared men make mistakes. We need to force his hand. She reached for her phone and dialed the Attorney General. The conversation was brief but decisive. By the time she hung up, the plan was in motion. By mid-afternoon, the walls around Donnelly's empire began to crack. The Attorney General's office issued a subpoena for the precinct records, targeting Donnelly's leadership and operational decisions. Officers began to whisper as investigators arrived, their presence a stark reminder that no one was above scrutiny. Donnelly's phone rang incessantly, each call bringing new layers of pressure. The mayor's office distanced itself, citing concerns over procedural integrity. His allies in the legislature fell silent, unwilling to be dragged into the growing storm. Rebecca, meanwhile, remained a step ahead. She coordinated with internal affairs officers across the state, ensuring that every piece of evidence was accounted for and every witness protected. Tyler's testimony, bolstered by corroborating documents, became the linchpin of her case. The following days unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Rebecca's team worked tirelessly, each move calculated to outmaneuver Donnelly's dwindling influence. The pressure became unbearable for those in his inner circle, and cracks began to show. One officer, a longtime confidant of Donnelly, came forward with damning evidence: falsified reports, secret payments, and direct orders to target specific individuals. The revelation shattered any remaining loyalty within the precinct. Donnelly, once untouchable, found himself cornered. The subpoenaed records revealed a pattern of abuse and corruption that could no longer be ignored. The Attorney General's office launched a full-scale investigation, and Donnelly was placed on administrative leave pending criminal charges. Rebecca visited Willow Creek Precinct 1 last time, her presence a quiet declaration of victory. As she walked through the halls, officers avoided her gaze, their silence a mix of shame and fear. She found Donnelly in his office, packing up his belongings. He didn't look up as she entered, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his anger. "You did this," he said finally, his voice low and bitter. Rebecca stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. "No, Chief, you did this. I just made sure everyone saw it." Donnelly turned to face her, his eyes hard. "You think this changes anything? Someone else will take my place. The system doesn't change." Rebecca's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. "The system changes one fight at a time. And today, this fight is mine." Donnelly said nothing as she left, the weight of his downfall settling around him. Weeks later, the investigation concluded with multiple arrests and policy reforms across the state. Donnelly was charged with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and conspiracy. Tyler, though complicit, received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Rebecca stood before a packed press conference, her voice steady as she addressed the public. "This is not just a victory against one man," she said. "It's a step toward accountability, toward justice. And while the work is far from over, today we've proven that no one is above the law." As the cameras flashed, Rebecca felt a sense of quiet resolve. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready. Justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a fight worth winning. And just like that, the mighty fall when justice stands tall. This isn't just a story about one cop's prejudice. It's a reminder that no one is above accountability, and the fight for fairness is far from over. If this story moved you, make sure to hit the subscribe button and join our community for more powerful tales like this. Don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Together, let's keep these important conversations alive. See you in the next story.